David never thought of himself as someone who stared at people. He was always careful about that sort of thing, always making sure he minded his own business. But something changed the day he walked into the downtown library on a Tuesday afternoon. He had just started working on his architecture portfolio. After years of working a regular office job, he finally decided to chase his real dream of becoming an architect. The library became his second home, a quiet place where he could sketch and plan without distractions. That's when he first saw her. She was sitting at the third table from the window, completely lost in her studies. Her long dark hair kept falling forward as she leaned over her books, and every few minutes she'd push her glasses back up without even looking away from the pages. There was something peaceful about the way she focused, like the entire world around her had disappeared. David told himself he wasn't really staring. He was just observing his surroundings, the way architects do. He was studying the light coming through the windows, the way people arranged themselves in the space. She just happened to be sitting in his view. That's all it was. But deep down he knew better. Every Tuesday and Thursday she'd be there at the same table. David started arriving earlier, just to make sure he got his usual spot where he could see her. He learned her little habits without meaning to. The way she always brought the same blue water bottle, how she'd tap her pen against her chin when she was thinking hard about something. The small smile that would cross her face when she finally understood something difficult. 3 weeks went by like this. David would work on his drawings, steal glances at her, and wonder what she was studying so seriously. The books looked medical, full of diagrams and complicated terms he couldn't read from where he sat. Sometimes he'd catch himself staring too long and quickly look away, embarrassed even though she'd never noticed. But one Thursday evening, everything changed. The autumn sun was setting, sending golden light through the tall library windows. David was stuck on a design problem, frustrated with the building he was trying to sketch. He looked up, hoping a break would clear his mind. And without thinking, his eyes went straight to her. This time, she looked up at exactly the same moment. Their eyes met directly, and David felt his heart jump into his throat. He'd been caught. There was no pretending he was looking at something else, no way to play it off. His face went hot with embarrassment, and he quickly dropped his eyes back to his sketchbook, pretending to be very interested in the lines on his page. He didn't dare look up for at least 5 minutes. When he finally risked a glance, he expected her to have moved seats or to be giving him an annoyed look. Instead, she was smiling. Not a big smile, just a tiny one at the corner of her mouth, like she found the whole thing amusing rather than creepy. David didn't know what to make of that smile. Was she laughing at him? Or was it something else? The following Tuesday, he almost didn't go to the library. He felt embarrassed, worried that he'd made her uncomfortable. But his work deadline was approaching and he needed the quiet space to focus. He arrived at his usual time, settled into his spot, and tried to concentrate on his drawings. She walked in 20 minutes later, and David kept his eyes firmly on his work. He was determined not to stare, not to make things weird. He could do this. He could be professional and respectful, but then he noticed something. She didn't sit at her usual table by the window. Instead, she chose a table that was much closer to him. Just one table away, close enough that he could hear when she turned the pages of her book. David's pencil hovered over his paper. Was this intentional? Had she moved closer on purpose, or was her usual table just taken by someone else? He snuck a quick look. Her usual table was empty. His mind raced with possibilities. Maybe she moved because she didn't want to be in his line of sight anymore. Maybe she was sitting closer so she could tell him off if he stared again. Or maybe, just maybe, she had moved closer for a completely different reason. For the next hour, David barely got any work done. He was too aware of her presence, too conscious of every movement he made. He kept his eyes on his sketches, but his mind was entirely on the person sitting just a few feet away. The library started to empty as it got later. The usual crowd of students and workers packed up and headed home for dinner. Soon it was just the two of them, the evening librarian and one old man reading newspapers in the corner. In the quiet, David could hear everything. The scratch of her pen on paper, the soft sound of her highlighting something in her textbook, the way she sighed when she stretched her neck, tired from studying. He risked another glance, and this time he really looked at what she was studying. Medical textbooks, definitely. Thick books with titles about anatomy and diseases. She must be a medical student, he thought. That explained the intense focus, the long hours of study. She looked up suddenly, and again their eyes met. This time David didn't look away immediately. Something made him hold her gaze for just a second longer. She didn't look annoyed or uncomfortable. If anything, there was curiosity in her expression, like she was trying to figure something out. Then she went back to her books, and David went back to his drawings, and the moment passed. But something had shifted. The air felt different, charged with possibility. David found himself smiling at his sketchbook for no reason at all. He didn't understand what was happening, but for the first time in weeks he felt genuinely happy. Not because of his architecture work or his plans for the future, but because of a simple exchange of glances with a stranger in a library. As the evening wore on, David started to pack up his supplies. He had an early meeting the next morning and needed to get home. He carefully rolled up his drawings, organized his pencils, and closed his portfolio. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw that she was still deep in her studies, completely absorbed. He stood up to leave, slinging his bag over his shoulder. As he walked past her table toward the exit, he couldn't help himself. He looked at her one more time. She was already watching him, and when their eyes met, she gave him that same small smile. This time, David smiled back. It wasn't much. They didn't speak, didn't exchange names or numbers. But as David walked out into the cool autumn evening, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The kind of hope that makes you look forward to Tuesday, that makes you wake up early and plan your day around being in a certain place at a certain time. He had no idea if anything would come of these silent exchanges. But he knew one thing for certain as he walked home through the city streets. He'd be back at the library on Thursday, sitting at his usual table working on his drawings, and maybe, just maybe, she'd be there too. Thursday couldn't come fast enough. David found himself checking the clock constantly at work, counting down the hours until he could head to the library. He felt like a teenager again, nervous and excited about something as simple as sitting in the same room as someone. When he finally arrived at the library that evening, his heart sank. She wasn't there. Her usual table was empty, and so was the one she'd moved to on Tuesday. David tried not to let disappointment show on his face as he settled into his spot and pulled out his work. Maybe she only came on Tuesdays. Maybe she'd decided to study somewhere else. Maybe she had better things to do than sit in a library near some guy who couldn't stop staring at her. David forced himself to focus on his portfolio. He had a big presentation coming up, a competition for designing a community center. This was his chance to prove he could make it as an architect, to show that quitting his stable job hadn't been a mistake. He needed to concentrate. An hour passed. Then another. The library filled with the usual evening crowd. Students claiming tables, professionals working on laptops. David made good progress on his designs despite checking the entrance every time someone walked in. He was so focused on his drawing that he didn't notice when she arrived. One moment the table near him was empty. The next moment she was there, settling into her seat with her bag and books. David's hand slipped, drawing a line clear across his sketch. He grabbed his eraser, trying to fix it while his heart pounded. She was here. She'd come. For the next 20 minutes, he tried desperately to work while being completely aware of her presence. He could smell her perfume now that she was closer, something light and floral. He could hear her flipping through pages, the sound of her pen moving across paper as she took notes. Finally, he allowed himself a quick glance in her direction. She was already looking at him. This time, neither of them looked away quickly. The moment stretched out, and David saw something in her expression that made his breath catch. She wasn't annoyed or uncomfortable. She looked interested, curious, like she was waiting to see what he'd do next. David gave her a small, awkward wave. She bit her lip, fighting back a smile, and waved back. That was it. Just a wave. But it felt like crossing a bridge, moving from complete strangers to people who at least acknowledged each other's existence. They went back to their work, but the atmosphere had changed completely. Now there was an awareness between them, an unspoken connection. Every so often, David would look up and find her glancing at him. Sometimes she'd catch him looking first. Each time they'd exchange small smiles before returning to their tasks. This pattern continued for the next 3 weeks. Tuesdays and Thursdays became the highlights of David's week. They'd arrive at the library, sit at their tables, work in comfortable silence and exchange glances that felt like conversations without words. David learned more about her through observation. She was a serious student, spending hours on the same material, reviewing notes multiple times. She drank her coffee black and always brought healthy snacks, usually fruit or nuts. She wore simple clothes, nothing fancy, but everything looked good on her. Sometimes she'd pull her hair back in a messy bun when she was really concentrating, and David thought that was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. He wondered what she was learning about him. That he was messy, probably, with papers always scattered across his table. That he got frustrated easily, erasing and redrawing the same lines over and over. That he drank too much coffee, and sometimes forgot to eat dinner because he was so focused on his work. One rainy November evening changed everything. The weather had been terrible all day, with heavy rain and strong winds that made people want to stay home. The library was almost empty, just a few dedicated souls who'd braved the storm. David had arrived early, determined to finish a difficult section of his design despite the weather. She came in about 30 minutes later, shaking rain from her jacket. Her hair was damp and she looked tired, like the long hospital shifts David suspected she worked were taking their toll. She settled at her usual table and pulled out her books, but her movements were slow, lacking their usual energy. David worked quietly, occasionally glancing over to make sure she was okay. She seemed to be struggling with her studies, reading the same page multiple times and rubbing her temples like she had a headache. After about an hour, she stood up and headed toward the restroom at the back of the library. In her tired state, she forgot her umbrella leaning against her chair. David watched as a particularly strong gust of wind rattled the windows, making the old building creak. The umbrella started to slide, about to fall to the floor. Without thinking, he got up and walked over to her table, catching it before it clattered down. He propped it more securely against her bag, where it wouldn't fall. When she came back a few minutes later, she stopped in surprise, seeing him standing near her table. "Your umbrella was falling," David explained quickly, suddenly feeling awkward. "I just wanted to make sure it didn't crash." "Thank you," she said, and her voice was warm and soft, exactly how he'd imagined it would sound. "I'm always leaving things behind or knocking them over. My friends say I'd lose my head if it wasn't attached." David laughed, and just like that, the ice was broken. "I'm Layla," she said, extending her hand. "David," he replied, shaking it. Her hand was small and warm in his. They stood there for a moment, neither quite sure what to say next. The rain hammered against the windows and thunder rumbled in the distance. "I know this might sound forward," Layla said, glancing toward the storm outside. "But would you want to get coffee? There's a cafe next door that stays open late, and honestly, I don't think I can focus on studying anymore tonight." David felt his heart leap. "I'd love that." The cafe next door was a tiny place, warm and cozy, with only a handful of tables. They shook the rain from their clothes and ordered at the counter. David got his usual black coffee while Layla surprised him by ordering a cappuccino with extra foam. "I thought you drank it black," David said without thinking, then felt his face go red. "I mean, I noticed in the library you always have black coffee." Layla raised her eyebrows, amused. "You've been watching me pretty carefully." "I'm sorry, that sounds creepy when I say it out loud." "No," she said, and her smile was genuine. "It's actually kind of sweet. For what it's worth, I noticed things about you too." They sat by the window, watching the rain stream down the glass while the cafe filled with the rich smell of coffee and fresh pastries. David felt nervous in a way he hadn't felt in years. This was different from the silent exchanges in the library. Now they had to actually talk, and he suddenly worried he'd have nothing interesting to say. But talking to Layla turned out to be easy. She told him she was in her final year of medical residency, specializing in emergency medicine. The textbooks he'd seen were for her board exams, which were coming up in a few months. She'd chosen emergency medicine because she loved the fast pace, the immediate problem-solving, the feeling of making a real difference in critical moments. "It's exhausting, though," she admitted, wrapping her hands around her warm cup. "Some weeks I work 100 hours. I see things that keep me up at night. People come in on the worst days of their lives, and I have to be calm and focused no matter what." "That sounds incredibly hard," David said. "It is, but it's also the most meaningful thing I've ever done." She looked at him with those intense eyes. "What about you?" I've seen all those building sketches. Are you an architect? Trying to be, David said. I actually spent the last 8 years working in finance. Good job, decent pay, completely wrong for me. I finally saved enough money to quit and go back to school. Now I'm working on my portfolio trying to break into the field. That takes courage, Layla said. Most people stick with the safe choice, or the stupid choice, depending on who you ask. My parents think I've lost my mind, giving up a stable career to chase a dream in my 30s. I don't think it's stupid at all. Life's too short to spend it doing something that makes you miserable. They talked for 2 hours straight. David learned that Layla had grown up in 3 different countries because her father worked for an international aid organization. She spoke 4 languages and had always known she wanted to help people. She loved reading mystery novels to relax, though she rarely had time for it anymore. She was terrible at cooking, but excellent at ordering takeout from every restaurant in the city. Layla learned that David had discovered his love for architecture by building elaborate structures with blocks as a kid. He'd spent his whole childhood drawing buildings and cities, but let practical concerns push him into finance after college. He loved old buildings more than new ones, finding beauty in the way structures aged and adapted over time. He ran every morning not because he enjoyed it, but because it was the only way he could clear his mind. The cafe staff started cleaning up around them, a gentle hint that closing time was approaching. David couldn't believe how fast the time had gone. I should let you get home, Layla said reluctantly. You probably have work tomorrow. So do you, David pointed out. Yeah, I have a shift starting at 6 in the morning. I'm going to be exhausted, she smiled, but this was worth it. They walked out into the rain, which had softened to a light drizzle. David offered to share his umbrella, and they stood close together under it, neither wanting to say goodbye. Same time Tuesday? Layla asked. The library? Or we could skip straight to coffee, she suggested. I mean, we've been sitting near each other for weeks. We might as well actually spend the time talking, David grinned. Coffee it is. After that night, everything changed. Tuesdays and Thursdays were still library days, but now they'd sit at the same table, instead of separate ones. They'd work in comfortable silence, occasionally sharing a thought or asking for opinions on their projects. Then they'd pack up and head to the cafe, sometimes talking for hours about everything and nothing. But they also started seeing each other outside their regular schedule. Weekend walks through the city. Quick lunches when Layla had a break between hospital shifts. Late-night phone calls when she couldn't sleep after a difficult day at work. David found himself falling for her in ways that surprised him. It wasn't just her beauty, though he thought she was stunning. It was the way she cared so deeply about her patients, staying late to make sure someone was comfortable or calling to check on them during her days off. It was her sharp sense of humor that could make him laugh even when he was frustrated with his work. It was the comfortable silence they could share, not needing to fill every moment with conversation. Layla felt it too. David made her feel calm in a way nothing else did. After chaotic shifts at the hospital, sitting next to him in the library while he sketched felt like coming home. He listened when she needed to talk about her day, really listened without trying to fix everything or give advice. He understood when she was too tired to be good company, never making her feel guilty for canceling plans or falling asleep during movies. Winter arrived, bringing cold winds and early darkness. The city transformed with holiday lights and decorations. David and Layla bundled up in coats and scarves for their walks, their breath visible in the frozen air. It was on one of these cold December nights that Layla's phone rang. She glanced at the screen and smiled apologetically. Sorry, I have to take this. It's the program director. David watched as her expression changed during the brief conversation. When she hung up, she looked troubled. Everything okay? He asked. Yeah, just, can we go somewhere warm? I need to talk to you about something. They found a quiet corner in a nearby cafe. Layla ordered tea, wrapping her cold hands around the cup, and David waited patiently for her to speak. I got offered a position, she finally said, at a hospital in Seattle. It's an incredible opportunity. One of the best trauma centers in the country. They want me to start in June, right after I finish my residency here. David felt like someone had knocked the wind out of him. Seattle. That was on the other side of the country, thousands of miles away. That's amazing, he managed to say. Congratulations. I accepted it, Layla continued, and her voice was barely above a whisper. I accepted it 3 months ago before I met you. Before any of this. The words hung in the air between them. 3 months ago. That was before their first conversation, before coffee, before everything. She'd already planned to leave before she even knew his name. "Oh," David said. "I didn't know how to tell you. Every time I tried, the words wouldn't come out. And I kept thinking maybe it was better not to say anything, to just enjoy what we have while we have it." David looked at her across the table. She had tears in her eyes, and he realized this was breaking her heart as much as it was breaking his. "How long do we have?" he asked quietly. 6 months. 6 months. Half a year. It felt like forever and no time at all. The next 2 weeks were the hardest of David's life. He and Layla tried to keep things normal, meeting at the library and going for coffee like always. But there was a weight to everything now, an awareness that their time together had an expiration date. David threw himself into his architecture work, staying up late perfecting his designs. If he kept busy enough, he could almost forget about June. Almost. Layla did the same, working extra shifts at the hospital and studying harder than ever for her boards. They were both trying to outrun the inevitable, staying too busy to think about what was coming. After 2 weeks of this exhausting dance, David made a decision. He couldn't do it anymore, couldn't pretend everything was fine when his heart was breaking. He texted Layla asking to meet up, and she suggested the same cafe where they'd had their first real conversation. She looked tired when she arrived. Dark circles under her eyes that told him she wasn't sleeping well either. "We need to stop this," David said before he could lose his courage. "Not us, but this avoiding the future thing we're doing. It's making us both miserable." Layla nodded slowly. "I know. I've been thinking the same thing." 6 months isn't very long," David continued. "And if we spend the whole time worrying about when it ends, we're going to waste the time we do have. So what are you suggesting?" David took a deep breath. "I'm suggesting we make a choice. Either we end this now cleanly, before it gets even harder, or we decide to take the 6 months we have and really live them. No talking about Seattle. No planning for a future we don't know how to navigate. Just being together right here, right now." Layla was quiet for a long moment, staring into her coffee. When she looked up, there were tears on her cheeks. "I don't want to end this," she said. "I can't. I've tried to convince myself it would be easier, but it wouldn't be. I'd rather have 6 months with you than nothing at all." Relief flooded through David. "Then let's make them count." They shook on it like it was a business deal, then laughed at how formal that seemed. But the agreement helped. Having a plan, even if it was just to enjoy the present, made things feel less overwhelming. The next few months became some of the best of David's life. He and Layla stopped holding back, stopped protecting themselves from getting too attached. They spent every free moment together, exploring the city like tourists seeing it for the first time. They found tiny restaurants in neighborhoods they'd never visited before. They went to museums on weekday afternoons when the crowds were thin. They took a weekend trip to the mountains, renting a cabin where they could see the stars at night, something impossible in the light-polluted city. David's architecture work flourished. Having Layla around actually made him more creative, not less. She'd look at his designs with fresh eyes, asking questions that made him think about his projects in new ways. Her medical knowledge helped him understand how people moved through spaces, how to design buildings that were both beautiful and functional. Layla studied with David nearby, finding that his quiet presence helped her focus better than studying alone ever had. He'd quiz her on medical terms and procedures, and somehow his terrible pronunciation and confused questions made the material stick in her mind better than any formal study group. They built routines together. Sunday morning runs through the park, even though Layla complained the whole time. Thursday evening cooking experiments, which usually ended with them ordering pizza because something had gone wrong. Late-night conversations on David's tiny balcony, talking about dreams and fears and everything in between. David met Layla's friends from the hospital, and she met his small circle of fellow architecture students. Everyone could see they were good together, the way they balanced each other out. David's calm steadiness grounded Layla's intense energy. Her passion and drive inspired him to take risks with his work he never would have tried before. But as March turned into April, Seattle started creeping back into their conversations despite their best efforts. Little things at first. Layla mentioning she needed to start looking for apartments. David noticing job postings in Seattle and wondering if architecture firms there needed someone with his skills. One warm April evening, They were sitting on David's balcony watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. David had been staring at Layla for several minutes, memorizing the way the light caught her face, the peaceful expression she wore when she was relaxed and happy. "You keep staring like that," she whispered, turning to look at him, "and I might start to like it." It was something she'd said to him weeks ago, teasing him about how he'd watch her sometimes with such intensity, but now the words carried different weight. There was sadness in her voice and acknowledgement of everything they weren't saying. "I already like it," David said quietly. "Actually, that's not true. I love it. I love you, Layla. I've been trying not to say it, trying to keep things light, but I can't anymore. I love you, and I don't know what to do about Seattle." Layla started crying, though she was smiling at the same time. "I love you too. So much that it scares me." They held each other as the sun finished setting, neither of them speaking. The unspoken question hung between them. What now? Finally, Layla pulled back and looked at him. "I have to tell you something." "I turned down Seattle." David's heart stopped. "What?" "I turned it down 3 weeks ago. I found a position here at City General Hospital. It's not as prestigious and the trauma department isn't as well known, but it's a good hospital. And more importantly, you're here." "But that was your dream job," David protested. "You said it was one of the best trauma centers in the country." "It was a dream job," Layla agreed. "But dreams change. A year ago, all I wanted was the best possible position, the most respected hospital. I thought success meant going wherever the opportunities were, no matter what I had to give up. But then I met you and you changed everything. Now my dream includes building a life with someone I love, not just building a career." David felt overwhelmed with emotion, relief, joy, love, but also something else. Guilt. "I should have fought for us," he said. "Instead of just accepting that you were leaving, I should have asked you to stay, or offered to come with you. I just didn't want to be the person who held you back from your dreams." "You didn't hold me back," Layla said firmly. "You made me realize what I really want. And honestly, staying here is better for me anyway. I'll be close to my family, I know the city, and the hospital has an excellent reputation. Plus, the cost of living is way better than Seattle." They laughed, and just like that, the tension broke. The future that had seemed so impossible suddenly felt manageable, even exciting. The relief David felt was incredible, like a weight he'd been carrying for months had finally lifted. But along with the relief came a realization that made him uncomfortable. He'd spent so much time assuming Layla would leave that he'd never really fought for their relationship. He'd accepted her departure as inevitable, never asking her what she wanted or offering alternatives. "I gave up too easily," he admitted. "I just assumed we couldn't make it work long distance or that asking you to stay would be selfish. I never even tried to find a solution." Layla shook her head. "You were trying to be respectful, not controlling. That's one of the things I love about you. You've never tried to make my decisions for me or guilt me into doing what you wanted. But I should have at least talked to you about options. I could have looked for jobs in Seattle, or we could have discussed doing long distance for a while. Instead, I just accepted that June meant goodbye." "We're both learning," Layla said. "This is my first serious relationship too. I've spent so many years focused on school and work that I never learned how to balance a career with caring about someone this much." They talked late into the night, really talked in a way they hadn't let themselves do before. They discussed what they wanted from life, from each other, from the future. It wasn't all romantic and easy. They disagreed on some things, like whether they wanted kids someday, or where they'd want to live long term. But they learned they could have those difficult conversations without fighting, could disagree while still respecting each other. The next few months brought new challenges, but different ones than before. Layla started her new position at City General, and the transition was harder than she'd expected. The hospital had different protocols, different equipment, different politics. She came home exhausted most nights, doubting whether she'd made the right choice. David's architecture career was finally taking off. He won the competition he'd been working on, and suddenly he had real clients wanting his designs. The work was exciting but overwhelming, with deadlines that kept him at his desk until late at night. They had to learn how to be together when life was stressful and complicated, not just during the honeymoon phase when everything felt easy. There were arguments about time management and whose career took priority on any given week. There were nights when they were both too exhausted to be good company for each other, but they also learned they were stronger together than apart. When Layla had a patient die on her watch for the first time at the new hospital, David was there to hold her while she cried. When David's biggest client threatened to pull out of a project, Layla helped him prepare his presentation, giving him confidence when he'd lost faith in himself. They figured out how to support each other without losing themselves. Layla kept her weekly dinner with friends from medical school, even when David had free time. David maintained his morning running routine, even though Layla wanted to sleep in on weekends. They learned that being in a relationship didn't mean doing everything together, that having separate interests and friendships made them better partners. 1 year after they first spoke in the library, David finished designing a small community health center in their neighborhood. It was his first major project to actually get built, and Layla had been involved from the beginning, helping him think about how patients would move through the space, what would make them feel comfortable and cared for. The opening ceremony was on a sunny Saturday afternoon. The mayor gave a speech, the local news covered it, and David felt proud in a way he never had during his finance career. He'd created something meaningful, something that would serve the community for years to come. Layla stood next to him, beaming with pride. She'd volunteered to work part-time at the new health center once it was fully operational, excited about bringing medical care to a neighborhood that desperately needed it. After the ceremony, they walked through the building together, hand in hand. David pointed out details he'd included based on her suggestions. The wide doorways that could accommodate wheelchairs and stretchers easily, the natural lighting in every room to make the space feel less clinical, the comfortable waiting area with toys for children and reading material for adults. "You built something amazing," Layla said. "We built it," David corrected. "This wouldn't exist without your input." They stood in the main lobby looking at the space they'd created together. It was more than just a building. It represented their partnership, the way they balanced each other and brought out the best in each other. "Do you ever regret it?" David asked suddenly. "Turning down Seattle for me?" Layla thought about it honestly before answering. "Sometimes I wonder what that path would have been like. But regret? No, I made the right choice for me, David, not just for us, but for me personally. I'm happy here. I love my work at City General, even though it's hard. I love living in this city, and I love building a life with you." "I'm going to ask you something," David said, his heart pounding. "And if it's too soon or you're not ready, that's okay. But I need you to know how I feel." He knelt down right there in the empty health center lobby, pulling a small box from his pocket. "I don't have a big speech prepared," he continued. "I just know that when I think about my future, every single version of it includes you. Will you marry me?" Layla stared at him, tears streaming down her face. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, absolutely yes." They held each other in the building David had designed, the one that represented everything they'd built together. It wasn't perfect. They both had demanding careers, student loans to pay off, and a tiny apartment that barely fit both their stuff. The future would bring more challenges, more stress, more difficult decisions, but they'd face it together. Later that evening, back at David's apartment, they sat on the balcony, watching the city lights twinkle in the darkness. Layla kept looking at the ring on her finger, smiling every time the light caught it. "I still catch you staring, you know," she said, glancing over at him. David didn't even try to deny it. "I know, I can't help it." "Good," Layla said, moving closer to him. "Don't stop." 2 years ago, David had been sitting in a library trying to sketch building designs, convinced his life was heading in one direction. He never could have imagined the stranger studying medical textbooks across the room would become the most important person in his world. Sometimes the best things in life aren't planned. Sometimes they're found in quiet moments, in accidental glances, in the courage to say hello to someone you've been watching from across the room. Sometimes love starts with something as simple as being caught staring, and having the other person smile back instead of looking away. David's architecture career continued to grow, but it was never just about the buildings anymore. Every design was better because Layla challenged him to think about the people who would use the space. Every success felt sweeter because she was there to celebrate with him. Layla's medical career flourished too. She became known at City General as a doctor who truly cared about her patients, who stayed late to make sure they understood their treatment plans, who never made anyone feel rushed or unimportant. And she credited David with teaching her the importance of balance, of taking care of herself, so she could take care of others. They were still learning, still figuring out how to build a life together, But they were doing it side by side, as partners, as best friends, as two people who'd found each other in the most ordinary place and created something extraordinary. And every so often, in quiet moments, David would catch himself staring at Layla with that same intensity he'd had in the library all those months ago, except now he wasn't embarrassed about it. Now he knew she loved it just as much as he loved looking at her, because that's what love is, really. It's choosing someone every single day. It's staring at them like they're the most interesting person in the world. It's building a life together, one small decision at a time until you can't imagine any version of your future without them in it.